Does it feel like I'm making this list a little too late? Well, better late than never. So, despite 2020 being the year the world was set on fire, it also marked the beginning of a new decade. And since we're still dealing with said fire, I think it's best to stay on the positive side of things by looking back on better times. The previous decade showered us with so many games, many of which have become instant classics that'll be remembered for years to come. As you'd expect, making a list of my personal favorite games from the past decade was really hard. Now, to make it on this list, the game has to have released in America, because that's where I live, between the start of 2010 and the end of 2019. And keep in mind, I have not played every game ever released within this time period, so there will be many games that probably won't make my list. It's also worth mentioning that some big-name, high-profile, very popular games didn't make the list. Sorry, Persona 5 and Fire Emblem Three Houses. That about covers the details, so let the chaos commence! If there's one group of games that saw a massive push in the last decade, that honor definitely goes to indie games. Some of the noteworthy ones that I managed to play include Undertale, Freedom Planet, and the first two Shantae games that were released in the 2010s. All great contenders, but come on, could it have been anything else to make my list? We all know which game was responsible for that massive push for indies to begin with. I'll admit, I haven't played much of Plague of Shadows, and I haven't even touched Spectre of Torment or King of Cards. But the one that started it all, Shovel of Hope, was more than enough to secure it a spot on my list. I wouldn't even call myself an NES connoisseur, and yet I really loved this game. Speaking of, yes, it's very evident that Shovel Knight takes inspiration from classic NES games, even getting down to the hard difficulty the NES is known for. It's a pretty fair challenge, providing excellent level design and intuitive gameplay. I also really enjoyed Shovel Knight's story. Yeah, it's a simple one, but there's clearly more to these characters than what's being told. And yes, I am aware that some characters are gone more in depth than other campaigns. The music, composed by Jake Kaufman, is a delight to hear. From the introductory roar of Strike the Earth, to the subterranean ballad of An Underlying Problem, to the final stand that is The Defender. But for me, I really enjoyed the boss fights. Yeah, some are easy, but others prove to be pretty challenging. It's really hard for me to go into any further detail since I've talked about this game many times on the channel. So I'll just end this part with this. If you haven't played at least Shovel of Hope, what are you waiting for? Do it now! Hard to believe we got four generations of Pokemon in the 2010s, as well as finally seeing the mainline Pokemon titles in full 3D. But which generation and game made the list? It was a tough choice between Gen 5 and Gen 7. Sun and Moon, the originals, not Ultra, had a fantastic story, great characters, a unique location, and best of all, a twist on the typical formula of the mainline Pokemon games. It came pretty close, but I'm giving this to Gen 5. Because while it didn't quite shake up the formula like Gen 7 did, my choice for the list had all those other things, and everything else. Now, you're all probably wondering why I didn't go with the first of the Gen 5 games for the list, considering Black and White's truly unique, well-written, thought-provoking story, as well as the games having one of the strongest and largest rosters of new Pokemon to date. Well, like I said, Black 2 and White 2 have all that and everything else. Well, okay, I'll admit, Black and White's story was the better of the two sets of games, but Black 2 and White 2's story was still a good one. I liked it simply because you got to see the aftermath of Black and White. What did the people you followed in the first games end up doing? What happened to Team Plasma and of N? Was that really all there was to the legend of the Dragon Pokemon? How did the Team Plasma incident affect the Unova region and its people? In regards to that last question, you get to see it in the form of your rival, Hugh, who despises Team Plasma and pursues revenge. And it still had its thought-provoking moments, especially with the scenes with Colress. But that's just the story. What about everything else? I mean, just look at it. As great as Black and White were, the Unova region structure felt very basic. Black 2 and White 2 improved and expanded it by making it more interconnected with new paths and locations, thus giving us more to explore and do than the first games. On top of that, you got new gym leaders, a much bigger roster of Pokemon to choose from, including Pokemon from other regions outside of Unova, and need I mention the Pokemon World Tournament where you can challenge gym leaders and champions from past games? The amount of content that Black 2 and White 2 provide remains the most impressive, to the point where you will be playing these games for days, even months just to finish everything. And I think that's where the major criticism lies with the newer games. I'm not saying the newer games are the worst things ever, but it does feel like they struggle to meet expectations after what Black 2 and White 2 did. But that just shows how well made the second Gen 5 games were. Maybe someday we'll see newer mainline Pokemon games strive to achieve what Black 2 and White 2 had. Hopefully. The 2010s marked the decade where I followed the full console life cycle of a non-Nintendo home console for the first time, the PS4, and after experiencing it, I'm definitely gonna wait before buying a PS5. Why? Because the PS4 didn't have as many games that I was interested in as the Wii U and Switch. Don't get me wrong, there were PS4 games that I liked. It's just, I have more interest in Nintendo games. What I'm trying to say is, this is the only PlayStation exclusive title on the list. Or should I say, former PlayStation exclusive title. So yeah, a Digimon game. It's a miracle that it actually got released in the West, considering, at the time of the game's announcement in Japan in 2013, the Digimon brand wasn't as popular in the West as it used to be back in the day. But ever since Digimon Fusion released and older Digimon series were put onto streaming services, awareness of the brand in the West began to rekindle, prompting Bandai Namco to give this game a Western release. And being the Digimon fan that I am, you bet I wanted to play this game. So, how is it? It's essentially Pokemon. No, really, that's the best way I can describe this. Well, okay, there are elements that allow it to stand out from Pokemon, like the story, more in a bit, but you're basically catching, or rather gathering data of Digimon that you find to birth new Digimon to train up and Digivolve. The gameplay is the standard 3-party members in battle setup, but you can have a full party of Mons, and all the Digimon have their own abilities, and are you seeing the Pokemon similarities here? It's fairly basic, and yet it's surprisingly engaging and enjoyable. As for the story Cyber Sleuth part of the title, yeah, you're an assistant detective stuck in a digital form of your own body, while your real body is in a coma. As a Cyber Sleuth, you solve Digimon-related issues in the internet and real world, from taking down rogue hackers, to dealing with paranormal urban legends, to ludicrous things like fixing a game developer's mobile game, or trying to figure out what's wrong with the AC of the mall that your detective agency is located, all while trying to figure out how to return to normal and confronting the main problem. Nihiligo's distant cousins 3 times removed from another dimension, aka the Eaters. On top of that, the 13 Royal Knights are also involved in the main plot with these Eaters. Some of them are good guys, but others, all I'm gonna say is, don't trust Kishibe and her charming demeanor. Overall, this is a game that I highly recommend. It and the sequel, which I haven't played too much of because game backlog, are on the Switch in the Complete Edition. So what are you waiting for? Go buy it! It's great! You know what else the 2010s brought us? Long-awaited returns of older game franchises. So nice to see companies showing love to franchises that seemed either long forgotten or, in the case of this next one, in need of a new game and return to form. Alright, so maybe the Kirby franchise wasn't exactly dead at the time of Return to Dreamland's release, but the last core Kirby game before it was a remake of an older game. And when we got the E3 2010 announcement that Kirby would be returning to home consoles, we got Epic Yarn. I'm not saying Epic Yarn or even Mass Attack are bad games, but many of us hardcore fans really wanted, as I said, a return to form. So when Return to Dreamland released, it was so nice to finally see Kirby being Kirby again. Sucking up bad guys, taking their powers, including some new abilities, this one's my favorite of course, and destroying absolutely everything in sight in charming, well-made levels, as well as awesome boss fights. Of course, to set itself apart from older entries in the series, we got the super abilities, extreme versions of other abilities in the game that added even more to the destruction arsenal. Yeah, super abilities were pretty much hard planted into the levels they appeared in, and yes, there were only 5 of them in total, but good gosh if I didn't have a blast with them. Plus, it's through the super abilities that we got those race to the finish courses towards the ends of the levels that use them. They aren't exactly the hardest things ever, unless you're playing extra mode, but it was a nice diversion. Now, about those awesome boss fights. Sure, some were easy as pie, but others proved to be a challenge to the point of being instant classics in the series. I stand by it. I find Return to Dreamland Dreamland to be the best of the modern Kirby titles, with Kirby Planet Robobot as a close second. Nothing against Triple Deluxe, it's just, to me, it really struggled to stay out of Return to Dreamland's shadow. Star Allies would have been a high contender for best Kirby game if it wasn't so easy, even for Kirby standards. Well, at least I have this to fall back on. Zelda. That's another game series that got many games released in the 2010s. We got new installments, remasters of older titles, a Warrior spin-off, a full remake of a Game Boy game, you know which game made the list. I wouldn't exactly call myself the biggest Zelda fan, but after playing Ocarina of Time in 2008, I was hooked and wanted more. However, none of the other mainline games really hooked me as much as Ocarina of Time. That is, until Breath of the Wild released. The game blew my expectations out of the park. Gone are the conventional, travel to new area, go to its dungeon, get new toy, fight boss, rinse and repeat days, and in its place is a more take it at your own pace approach. Because there's a lot to see, do, and everything else in this post-apocalyptic Hyrule. Of course, if the dungeons and puzzle solving were your thing, they get you covered with the over 100 shrines scattered throughout the land, as well as the 4 kaiju-sized divine beasts serving as the normal dungeons of the game that provide story progression. And yeah, the divine beasts aren't the most complex or challenging things in the series, but you can do them in any order you want. Again, going back to the whole take it at your own pace approach, because really, it is all about the exploration. I mean, you never know what kind of secret or special location you'll find next. As for the story, it's also one of the more unique stories in the series. For one, it's the first core Zelda game to be fully voice acted, breathing life and character to the, well, characters. And to think this game's story begins sometime after the hero's defeat. Yeah, it's a shame we don't get to learn too much about the 4 other champions, or even the events of 100 years past besides the basics. But thankfully, a canon Hyrule Warriors game that explains all of that got released in 2020. And let's not forget that Breath of the Wild is getting a sequel. Just goes to show how much of a milestone this one game did for the series. Makes you wonder how they're gonna top it. Because of course, I stand by it, this is the best mobile game from Nintendo. Admittedly, while I have been with the game since it launched, I didn't truly become fully engaged with the game until the first New Year's event, and from that point on, I was hooked on its world, characters, and gameplay. Speaking of the latter, at its base elements, it's a top-down dungeon crawler action RPG, with the key feature of the gameplay being able to transform into, what else? A freaking dragon. There are many ways to play this game, like horde battles, defensive battles, and even awesome raid boss events. But for a real test of your skills of the gameplay system, you turn to the high difficulty content like the Advanced Dragon Trials, Agito Uprising, and Rise of the Sinister Dominion. Though these harder trials can be a bit of a turn-off since there is little room for error in these fights, but the devs continue to balance and improve the game to make it more approachable for new players, making the huge grind for getting your character stronger for those boss fights much less of a headache, sort of. And speaking of characters, the playable adventurers are what make the gameplay for me. I mean, I did a whole list of some of my favorites. Many of them have unique, very fun playstyles, and while newer adventurers were becoming a bit more powerful than older ones, version 2.0.0 came in to balance a majority of the characters and dragons to level the playing field. But my personal favorite thing about this game is its world and story. Without going into too much detail, the main campaign story has quite the twists and turns, not to mention all the characters and periodic events that keep getting added that bring their own stories that build upon the world and its lore. It's a shame that not a lot of people talk about this game beyond some of the insane crossovers it's had. I get it, it can be kind of hard, and it is a gacha game after all, but it's a very generous one, and the 2.0.0 update released on the game's second year anniversary really made the game feel like a fresh start to get new players hooked on the game. I don't know what the future holds for the game, but I'm sticking with it to the end no matter what. Wow, I've gone through this whole video without a single original game from the Nintendo 3DS making the list up to this point. Well, that ends now, with the only 3DS game on here. Kid Icarus Uprising. After it was announced, we waited for what felt like an eternity for this game to come out. And when it did not disappoint. Yeah, you'll get the naysayers complaining about the controls, and while I'm not saying it isn't a valid criticism, I honestly didn't have much of an issue with it. Yes, my hands did cramp a little the first time I played it, but I couldn't stop playing it because it's so good! It got to the point where my hands actually got used to the controls and stopped cramping. Of course, the game did come packaged with a stand to help with the hand cramps, though good luck finding a sealed copy of the game with the stand these days. Despite this, I still highly recommend this game. The action of both the on-rails air battles and the on-foot land battles is just so frantic that you'll keep coming back for more. And the weapon variety, oh, the weapon variety. It's just perfect! 9 weapon classes, each with their own wide array of weapons to choose from. You'll definitely find a playstyle that works for you. Longtime viewers of the channel all know which weapon class I love, but easily the most memorable part of the game is its witty writing and characters. You got Pit, our airheaded punching bag of a main hero that we all love, Palutena with her sass and trolling, Dark Pit, the cool yet unpredictable anti-hero, Hades with his even more insane trolling and massive destruction of the fourth wall, and Viridi and her hatred for humans that even extends into Super Smash Bros.
Yep, the monkeys were eradicated! Booyah!
Is this funny to you? Human extinction is a game? You think that's a fucking joke?
And don't forget that awesome multiplayer. Even the online for it was pretty decent. You got a standard free-for-all mode, but the best, and my favorite mode, was Light vs. Dark. I played that online for hours. There's a reason why so many are clamoring for a port or even a sequel to this game. It's just so much fun, and we all have Masahiro Sakurai to thank for it. Though he has come out and said it would be difficult to make a port or sequel, and all the work he's pouring into Smash Ultimate isn't making that any simpler. Speaking of... it's not number 1! Though I've had more time with Smash for Wii U, in terms of a console experience, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is everything that Smash for Wii U should have been. But then again, this one game is the ultimate Smash Bros. Package, giving you pretty much everything you could ever want in a Super Smash Bros. Title. This was evident in its roster. Everyone is here, no one was left out. Your favorites from older installments that got cut in later games? Not an issue. Now as for the gameplay, it's relatively the same as it's always been, but fine-tuned and made in a way that's catered more to competitive players, but also easy to understand for newer players now that some of the more advanced techniques are a little bit easier to pull off. However, and I wish I had brought this up in my review of the game, the major focus on offensive play and nerfs to defensive tactics does make it feel a little unfair, since there are times where I find it hard to get out of an opponent's attack and have a chance to fight back. But other than this, the gameplay is still pretty solid and fun. And again, that's the key that makes this game great. It does a lot to maximize the experience and fun factor. All veteran characters are back, several older stages are back. Classic mode is different and unique for each of the over 80 characters available, and there are so many new modes that were added to shake up the experience, like Squad Strike, Smashdown, and especially Spirits and its accompanying adventure mode. And yeah, online is still not entirely spot on, but thankfully they've addressed the concerns and have improved on it, making it much better than it was at launch. My only gripe with the base game was its minuscule number of new, original fighters and stages, but DLC helped to fix that. Overall, this is, quite simply, the best Super Smash Bros. Game to date. It is gonna be hard to top it, because as I've said, it is truly something special and ultimate. What can be said about Xenoblade Chronicles? Well, it's not number 1, but it sure as heck cements itself at second place on my list. It's funny, I managed to get this game when it was released officially in the States, but I barely touched it for the longest time after I got it. At first, I wasn't feeling it with the gameplay, and, well, it released at a time where I just wasn't playing the Wii all that much, and I wished I hadn't stopped playing it. Many of the online personalities I followed wouldn't shut up about how great it was, and then Sugar Conroy announced his LP of the game, and so I decided to use this opportunity to finally sit down, give this game another chance, and play it. So did my opinions on it change? It's number 2 on the list. What do you think? Seriously, it lives up to the hype. The battle system, well, not the most conventional thing ever with its focus on auto attacks and positioning, is still very unique and engaging. Not to mention seeing into the future to see what your enemies are going to do next and plan accordingly is a nice feature. The locations you travel to are some of the most gorgeous and breathtaking I've ever seen in a game. It's very impressive how Monolith managed to make giant, explorable, open-world areas in a Wii game of all things and actually have it working on the hardware. And let's not forget the story and characters. It's an epic like no other, with the majority of the characters going through a lot of growth and development throughout it. My only gripe with the original Wii release of the game is how it handled side quests. They piled way too many on the player, making it very hard to keep track of all of them, and very hard to actually try to find what you need for the quests. But even so, even after all these years, this is a definite must-play if you haven't already. And that's why all the footage you're seeing is of the Definitive Edition. This is as good of a time as ever to play the original Xenoblade Chronicles, as the Definitive Edition is the best way to experience it. What with all the changes it got, especially to side quests. Plus, it looks even better than it did before, and you get a new post-game story to dive into if you were craving for more after clearing the main game. Monolith, you did good in crafting this modern masterpiece of a game, and I look forward to what you have in store for us next. And now for honorable mentions. There's no time to go into detail on these games, so here's a list of the games that didn't quite make the list. So, we've had quite the selection of games appear on the list, but if you know me, you might have noticed that a certain team-based third-person shooter multiplayer Nintendo franchise has been surprisingly absent up until now. Bet you didn't expect Splatoon to be at the top, did you? But the question is, which one? The original or the sequel? The original Splatoon was great, introducing a new, unique third-person shooter experience like none before it, thanks in part to its concept and cartoony art style. Splatoon 2 is definitely a much more balanced game than the first, and offers a lot more content, free and paid, than the first game could ever hope to match. But alas, there can only be one. Splatoon 1. Yes, I'm giving the gold to the original Splatoon, the game that started it all. Again, it introduced a fresh take on team-based shooter games, with its unique concept of squid kids covering the map with ink, swimming through it to move around, and taking out opposing inklings to prevent them from claiming your turf. And I loved every moment of it. Now I could go on about other things it offered, like ranked, Splatfests, its single-player mode actually being quite nice, but I gotta be real with you all, none of that is the main reason why it's at the top. The reason why the original Splatoon is my game of the decade is because if it wasn't for this game, I never would have met the friends I have now. I never would have met internet personalities that I've always wanted to meet. I never would have had the fond memories I have of playing with and against these friends online in Splatoon, or any other games for that matter, and having fun every step of the way. To think, this all started when I happened to find Mom Anella's, that's Miss Anella's mom, Twitter page one day. I followed her and noticed she posted a lot about Splatoon and mentioned it in a reply. She then invited me to play with her in some matches, and it was a lot of fun. Yes, Miss A and occasionally Chugga were there. But more importantly, so was a girl named Jenny, username fetchgames. We found each other on Twitter, we chatted, and then one day she invited me to join her Skype group. Yes, that's how long ago this was. And the rest is history. Since then, I've managed to meet these friends of mine in person at MAGFest a few times, and even got to meet the Runaway Guys, Masae, and Mom Anella. I even ended up participating in Thrown Controllers one year, and it was all because I was invited to play some matches with Mom Anella in the original Splatoon. Sure, the sequel is a much better, more balanced game than the first, to the point where there's pretty much no reason to go back to the first game unless you want a nostalgia trip, though I only recommend doing private matches. Not to mention a third Splatoon game is on the way, but for the impact it had on my life, the original Splatoon had to take this spot. You may be somewhat obsolete, but you'll never be forgotten. I'm KioskKey4013, and though the world is on fire, gaming is still going strong and pushing onward regardless. So no matter what happens, I'm positive that gaming will be there to brighten our days for even more decades to come.